Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's program, How Can We Build Science into Management of Technology? I'm Madison Calhoun, ELI's educational programming attorney. This is a hybrid event, so we have a sizable audience online. Welcome, no matter whether you're online or in person here in DC with us. I have just a couple of quick logistical remarks before we get started. So for our online audience, we will be taking audience questions at the end of today's program. Please just submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function as soon as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the end of the program. Just submit them as soon as your questions come up. Additionally, the chat will be open, but please post any questions that you wish for our speakers to see in the Q&A, not the chat. But you're welcome to converse with one another throughout the program in the chat. For our in-person audience, please just hold your questions until the end, and we will call on you as time permits. Lastly, today's program will be recorded and posted to ELI's website for members to view later. Just be sure that you're logged into your member account in order to see it. And with that, I will hand things over to our wonderful moderator today, David Downs, who joined ELI as a visiting scholar in February of 2025. He is an experienced leader, advisor, analyst, teacher, and mentor in the fields of environment and natural resources with a focus on international law and policy. From January 2010 to January 2025, David served in the Office of International Affairs of the U.S. Department of the Interior, where he led a team that represented the department and supported high-level engagement on international natural resource, environmental, and indigenous issues. From 2000 to 2010, David was the trade advisor for Interior, advising and representing the department in interagency policy deliberations and on U.S. delegations for numerous bilateral, regional, and global trade and investment negotiations. Before entering federal service, David practiced law in the nonprofit sector with the Center for International Environmental Law. I'll hand things over to you, David. Thank you so much.
For all your support organizing this event, and I'm very grateful to ELI for hosting. Special thanks to Carl Brook for getting us started on this panel discussion. I'm honored to serve as moderator with such distinguished panelists to discuss such an important and timely topic. Increasingly powerful technologies have raised standards of living, quality of life, and well-being for people around the world, but they can also have significant negative impacts and pose serious threats to health and the environment. Science drives technological advances and also informs the responses to the impacts of technology. When I refer to science, I just want to know that science is not simply a body of knowledge, but a process, a method, an enterprise to develop knowledge and understanding. Science has produced some important successes in terms of addressing threats from technology, like reducing pollution, both nationally and internationally, but the response to some well-demonstrated threats, such as climate change, being inadequate, and emerging advances in fields like genetic engineering, offer grave risks as well as great benefits. Meanwhile, public trust in science and public funding of science are in decline, while misinformation is increasing dramatically. So what to do to strengthen the role of science in addressing technology's impacts? Today, our panel will explore the following questions. How can we best develop and apply the science needed to manage technology's impacts? How can science be developed so as to engage constructively and build trust with both policymakers and the public? And how can we do a better job of bridging the gap between scientific knowledge of technology's impacts and the actions needed to manage those impacts? With that background, I am honored to introduce today's speakers, starting with Charles Weiss, beside me. Charles is Distinguished Professor Emeritus and former Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He was the first science and technology advisor to the World Bank. He has written several books relevant to our conversation today, and in particular, I'd like to highlight his most recent book, The Survival Nexus, which provides a remarkable and comprehensive overview of the issues we'll be talking about today, the interweaving of science and technology with international affairs, politics, economics, law, business, and culture, as it affects global issues such as nuclear weapons, pandemics, climate change, internet governance, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Charles is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and has a PhD in chemical physics and biochemistry from Harvard University. And then I'd like to introduce Angela Bednarek, who leads scientific advancement at the Pew Charitable Trust, which includes efforts to support groundbreaking science and to ensure that research informs public policy and improves outcomes. In this role, she co-founded and leads the Impact Funders Forum, a global collaborative aimed at closing the gap between research and outcomes. She has published and presented widely on improving the connections between research, policy, and practice. Angela has previously served as an American Association for the Advancement of Science Diplomacy Fellow, a AAAS Fellow in the Office of Environmental Policy at the U.S. Department of State. She served as a fellow at the Earth Institute of Columbia University and a scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. She holds a PhD in biology from the University of Pennsylvania. And then next to Angela, we have Yuha Wito, visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute. As a strategic advisor, Yuha supports evaluation functions with a focus on the nexus of development, environment, and climate change. Previously, he served as the director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the Global Environment Facility. Prior to that, he served in the Independent Evaluation Office of the United Nations Development Program and has held other roles at UNDP, GEF, and the United Nations University. He's board member of the International Evaluation Academy and co-coordinator of the Monitoring and Evaluation Interest Group of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. A native of Finland, Juha was educated at the universities of Helsinki and Lund, and he holds a PhD in social and economic geography. So again, I'm really honored to be with such distinguished speakers today. And I will turn now, we'll hear first from Charles, then from Angela, and then Juha will provide comments on those presentations, and then we'll move to question and answer after that. So thank you all for joining, and Charles, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. It's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar with the Environmental Law Institute, which is an organization I have long admired. I want to thank David Downs, Madison Calhoun, and especially Carl Brook, Kirk Talbot for giving me this opportunity. And of course, this from the Shameless Commerce Division. I want to talk today about global technology-driven challenges that endanger human survival: nuclear war, climate disruption, pandemics, artificial intelligence, geoengineering, gene drivers, many more. The world will have to face these issues together, whatever the geopolitical system that emerges from the present turmoil, and whoever wins out in the current technological competitions. These global threats are environmental issues in the broadest sense. Nuclear war, for example, is not good for the environment. Each of these threats evokes concern that science and technology are out of control and are taking us in unwanted directions. Each require that we make policy decisions based on the best science, and that we mobilize science, technology, and innovation to deal with them. This is a tall order, but it's been done. The defense of the atmospheric ozone layer, the stratospheric ozone layer, I should say, is a classic success story. Scientists alerted the world to chemicals destroying the stratospheric ozone layer and causing an epidemic of skin cancer. An epistemic community of scientists and journalists, and later a formal scientific advisory committee, educated diplomats and policymakers. The outcome was the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, and subsequent amendments that have brought the problem under control. This is a difficult time for global solutions to global problems. As we all know, there's in many countries a widespread distrust of scientific expertise and truth. The US is harassing or dismantling many of the very NGOs, think tanks, and government agencies and research laboratories that are needed to integrate science, technology, and innovation with foreign policy, present company, I must say, included. Internationally, multilateral structures for dealing with global issues have been allowed to deteriorate. Nuclear arms control regimes are being allowed to lapse. The US, Russia, and China are expanding or updating their new nuclear arsenals, threatening a three-way arms race that can easily get out of control. Binding agreements have failed to meet agreed targets for ending global warming. Absent sustained political determination to fight climate change, private business is reluctant to invest in needed research, technology, and innovation. Governments are discouraging the collaborative discussions and research that are needed to develop common understanding of global threats to which we are all subject, whatever country we live in. Against this background, we arrive at the questions that ELI and David have posed for us to explore in this webinar. How do we ensure that we understand the impact of these technologies and the options for managing them? Excuse me, I have a cold. And that this understanding is shared by governments and by people with different political systems and values. Can we engage the public in developing this understanding? Will this restore public trust in scientific expertise? Most importantly, can we bridge the gap between increased knowledge and more effective action? In sum, can we mobilize science and technology to meet these global challenges? The COVID pandemic provided lessons, both positive and negative. On the positive side, scientists developed new vaccines in 1 year instead of the usual 10, based on 20 years of basic scientific research. Operation Warp Speed, a policy innovation, saved time by paying manufacturers to scale up production of promising vaccines while testing for safety and effectiveness was still underway. On the negative side, scientists failed to anticipate how public health measures would affect education and public morale. Governments downplayed the pandemic and hawked discredited, quote, cures, unquote, or used public health measures as a way to suppress civil liberties. On the ethical side, wealthier countries delayed sharing scarce vaccines with low-income countries. In all of these examples, science, technology, and innovation are intimately interwoven with each other and with politics, economics, law, business, culture, and ethical values. Renewable energy, for example, involves not only research and development, but also manufacturing, trade, competitiveness, subsidies, carbon pricing, and our ethical obligations to future generations. Artificial intelligence, for that matter, raises any number of issues of security, privacy, and civil liberties. The current crisis in our legacy systems is an opportunity to rethink how to deal with the science, technology, and innovation dimensions of today's potentially catastrophic global issues. We have to think long range. We can't afford nostalgia for what we have lost. For now, we need to do our best to defend federal support to science policy, research, development, and innovation, specifically including manufacturing and key technologies. This will require an all-hands-on-deck effort to restore the public trust in expertise that has traditionally underpinned public support to science, technology, and innovation. We'll need more scientists, innovators, and policymakers who understand each other's fields. We'll need university curricula to train them, venues where they can work together, and ways to involve the public in the resulting discussions. All this will require substantial changes in culture, career paths, and educational systems. Internationally, we need venues where experts from different countries can develop the mutual trust needed to work out a common international understanding of global threats, to develop a framework within which they can be managed, and to formulate regimes and norms to guide the behavior of governments, businesses, international organizations, and individuals, especially the super rich, who today command resources comparable to those of governments. Yes, norms are collapsing all around us, but they kept us out of nuclear war. And besides, they've all we got. We also need networks of civil society thinkers spanning different parts of the world. If all goes well, ideas from these networks will gradually coalesce, influence local judges and policymakers, and work their way into judicial decisions and formal international agreements. Such networks are already proposing norms on artificial intelligence, geoengineering, and other subjects. Here are a few suggestions for international norms related to the management of potentially catastrophic global threats. Don't make nuclear power plants military targets. The International Atomic Energy Agency has developed such a norm, but it needs higher visibility and more teeth. Don't spread mis or disinformation, and don't suppress relevant research and innovation. Accept the obligation to do your share of research within your capabilities on the nature and consequences of global threats. I stress the word obligation. Collaborate within and across boundaries on both curiosity motivated and non-proprietary applied research and technological development. Share knowledge and technology with low-income countries and build their capacity to contribute to the management of global threats. In sum, accept the facts that potentially catastrophic global challenges are problems that we all face, regardless of politics, that they all have important elements of science, technology, and innovation, and that we should all do our share in addressing them. Finally, and perhaps most important to ourselves, when the US rebuilds our system for science and technology and innovation, we should encourage international collaboration and research, and should strengthen the research and policy arms of key institutions like EPA and NOAA and others, many others, giving them an explicit mandate to identify key innovations that are unlikely to attract private support, to develop programs to support them, and to identify and eliminate obstacles to their development and commercialization. That's the difference between an invention and an innovation, is somebody who uses it on a large scale. I would further suggest an advanced research project agency for potentially catastrophic global challenges on the model of the ARPAs that already link cutting-edge technology to felt needs in defense, intelligence, and health. All this will take time. It's taken the world a long time to get where we are. It's not an event of just the last few months, and it will take us a good while to recover. We shouldn't lose heart, but we better get started, both in thinking and in acting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these inspiring and insightful remarks. Gives us a lot to think about. I'd like now to turn to Angela Benarek. Angela.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you to colleagues here at ELI for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And it's nice to follow Charles. And some of my presentation will explore some of the ways in which this group of funders that I mentioned or that David mentioned in my intro, how we've been thinking about taking some of those interventions and making them real. Not all of them, that's a bit tall order, but at least some of them. So I'll start by sharing a little bit more about this group and the sort of shared priorities and principles that we that really drive our work together, and then get into some of the promising strategies and ways we're thinking about moving forward. Before I go into this group and the work that I've been doing is not explicitly focused on tech into decision-making and management, but much more broadly, how do we think about science, evidence, research, how does that feed into decision making about lots of societal issues? And the really wonderful thing about this group, one of the many wonderful things about this group, is that by taking that larger sample size of how does it work to close the gap between the research we're funding and the outcomes we seek, by taking that larger sample size of issue areas, we can get a better idea of what are promising strategies, what are best practices, and what are the real cross-cutting gaps and needs. So just wanted to start there. See if okay. So I mentioned the Impact Funders Forum. This is a group, collaborative of research funders, both public and private, so philanthropies around the world, all interested in closing the gap between the research science we fund and the outcomes we hope get better in the world. I mentioned that we take a really large view. We are very cross-cutting in the kinds of issues that we care about as individual research funders. They do include those focused on environment, but it spans the gamut with public health, criminal justice, education, you name it. We've been very agnostic about the kinds of social issues you cover if you are interested in that sort of intersection in closing that gap. And what do you do to close that gap? We share a few, we agree on a few things within this group, even though we're quite, we're quite cross-cutting. One is that we recognize that most social issues are wicked problems that are incredibly complex and don't really, aren't easily addressed by siloed work, by short-term work, by short-term thinking, that we really have to lean into the complexity of these problems. And when we start there, then we can get better at understanding how to address them with our individual efforts, but also as a collective. And it helps that my background is in ecology. So I always think about this work as an ecologist does, and that it's an ecosystem and you can't really, push on one part without really affecting the rest. So we start there though, which is most social problems are wicked problems, and we better get our heads around how do you recognize the reality of that. The second sort of shared priority, shared value that we come at this work together with is that we want to be evidence-based about how we go about closing the gap. So we sometimes say, well, this gets, a little meta, but how can we, if we really want to encourage the use of research, the research and evidence and science can make a difference, we should be as science-based and evidence-based about that process. So let's not just guess what works, but let's be evidence-based. It seems simple, but it's sort of shocking how little work is guided by the evidence-based, and it's really guesswork. Like, it feels like we should communicate more about X. Well, if does the evidence bear that out? Do studies bear that out? Sometimes, a lot of times, no. And so we think a lot about what that evidence-based is and how do we use that to guide our work. So in this slide, there's a really wonderful evidence base about how research is best positioned for use and to make a difference. I'm pulling out a nice simple rubric here from some colleagues in education space that what do we know about what it takes to close the gap? Research needs to be relevant. Seems simple, but it is a really strong predictor of success. You need to have, it needs to be relational, at least in some part, to build trust, to allow those involved in a process to make sense. So there's a relational aspect. It doesn't mean that everything has to be community engaged research, but there needs to be some element of relationship building in that process. And then the last is really focused on the demand side for research and evidence, the use of it, which there needs to be routines and infrastructure for that use. You can't just lob or build a relationship and lob a bunch of research into a process without there being some structure for that use, routines, processes, people who understand what that looks like. So that the 3 R's is one way to think about this: relevant, routines, and relational. So what we know about some of the elements of solutions, and I'm going to give a few examples here, is that a lot of engaged in sustainability environment, sometimes it's called transdisciplinary co-produced research. How are we including those who might be impacted or use the research in the development of the research questions themselves? Sometimes people in my circle say maximizing relevance and rigor. How do we ensure that research is rigorous? Because we know we want that, and it's relevant. We also know there's a great deal of translation and research mobilization. Time, I mentioned time for relationship building and sense making. Cross-disciplinary, Charles mentioned, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary partnerships. That goes back to the reality of wicked problems. A lot of folks think about, let's start with the use of the demand and then work our way backwards. So we think about, though we know there's elements of success. So what does that look like in practice? An example here from some of my previous work at Pew, funding policy relevant research about the oceans. We think about how we can support research teams to co-define research agendas with those who might use it or be impacted. So in this, the circle with the fisheries, we'd include research scientists who study fisheries, government fishery managers, the fishery industry themselves, NGOs. All of those folks come together to shape the research question. Now that sounds really messy, but there are rubrics, there are ways to do that. We have funded some of that at Pew. My colleagues in the education space do a parallel process where they include school districts and researchers and communities all together to shape what are the research questions that are most pressing right now for a school superintendent about X, Y, or Z. How do you make sure that those are reflected in the research agendas? Pulling an example from colleagues at the Consortium for Science Policy Outcomes here in DC, ASU's campus, participatory technology assessment is another way to build relevance by taking large groups of the public and bringing them together to understand what are they thinking about in terms of what's the problem with technology at hand right now. They've done an example on driverless cars. What are the real issues from the public that they see, and how can we this is very facilitated. How can a deliberative process be structured so that those views are incorporated into the development of those technology or the evolution of those technologies? So these are really promising strategies that have experience and a length of time to show how they work. Oh, and then the last example here that I'll give is on that evidence use side. So I don't know, I'm sure this group is familiar with the Evidence Act. You think about that as a structured way, going back to those routines within decision-making bodies and the infrastructure. The Evidence Act, which was very strongly bipartisan effort, brings those routines into federal agencies. Now, in 2025, there's a whole lot going on, but the intent was to bring those routines and infrastructure through agency learning agendas to ensure that there was a system and routines for bringing that research and evidence into lots of kinds of decision-making. Give just a few more examples here to give you a better sense of how this funder collaborative works. This is going back to the sort of shared way of thinking about problems. When we think about the kind of work we want to do together, we think about these three pieces of the pie. We want to know if we're going to invest money and invest research. We want to know what works to close the gap. We want to invest in what works to close the gap. And we know that as a cross-cutting group, we can't do that in isolation. So we work together to shape system change and infrastructure at a system level to enable all of that to go forward. A few examples of some of our initiatives. We organize our funders and our participants into a couple of key priority areas. One of the sort of the earliest working group and initiative that we had, and we still continue to this day, is like how research funders are funding. How do we construct our processes and priorities and practices so that we're reflecting that best practice, that we're really supporting those interventions that work? A second big initiative that we have right now is around university leadership. This was before 2025. It was bringing together university leaders, we're still doing it though, to think about what are the elements of a responsive, resilient research system that supports that relational, routine, relevant work, incentivizes university research to engage in that work. It is often counter to promotion and tenure, other kinds of incentives within universities. So we've been working with this group of university leaders to understand where's promising progress that we can lean into together. Recently, we stood up a state science and technology policy fellows initiative that is similar to the federal AAAS Science Technology Fellowship Program, but focused just on state legislatures. This is brand new. We just started it this summer, building on some promising practice, some promising pilots, and some work around the country. We're going to be expanding this to more states. And it's really about how, again, thinking about that demand side, thinking about the routines within state legislatures. How can we build that capacity? How can we strengthen those interventions? And then the last example I'll give is that, and I thought this might be relevant for this group, is through this work, we also tried to surface, like, what's a really interesting, cool, innovative thing that's happening right now? These are some colleagues that started in Australia and have now work around the world. Again, thinking about how do we make research more relevant, more relational, and the routines to use it. This is a technique called living evidence synthesis. It takes evidence, bodies of evidence from around the world, uses machine learning to update it in real time, to get it to policymakers in real time. And so happy to share more about this. This group has been started really small, but thought, why are we funding things and then 2 years later spitting something out the other end and expecting that issue is still on the table or on the policy docket? How can we get better at getting that in real time? This is a great use of AI and machine learning to make that happen. But they also, importantly, incorporate a relational aspect to this. So there's regular facilitation and consultation with those using this evidence and research to make sure that relational component. So they're not just maximizing relevance there, but they're also thinking about the relational component. So that was that. I wanted to share a couple of different examples from our work and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Angela. That was another wonderful presentation with a lot of food for thought. And now I'd like to turn to Yuha Wito to provide some comments and reflections in response to these very stimulating remarks from our speakers.
Thank you, David, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. I can't think of a more timely and important topic than what we have here today. So I'll provide a few observations, hopefully not entirely random observations to what we have heard today. So as these global challenges, whether they are from climate change or pandemics or AI or whatever, as they grow more complex, we do depend on scientific knowledge and technological innovation to navigate them and manage them. But science, as we have been already discussing, science itself has become kind of under suspicion. Many now perceive it as part of an elite project responsible for these very problems that we are trying to solve here now. And this erosion of trust is deeply concerning, and it is the widespread inability of many of our brethren, if you wish, to distinguish between scientific evidence and opinion. And I think that this problem is not limited to the uneducated, but even amongst my field. So I'm coming from the environmental field. So we have a lot of advocates in that field who are skeptical about technological solutions, whether it's carbon capture or or any others. Charles was already referring to geoengineering here, but not everything is geoengineering. I believe that we need to have some technological solutions to the climate crisis, for example, because just the energy transition and behavior change that we're all talking about, they won't be enough to keep us within the Paris targets. So we have to be open to different solutions, but at the same time, we have to, of course, be very clear on both the upsides and the risks that are involved, and that's a scientific task. Of course, we have this systematic defunding of science and dismantling of the scientific infrastructure that we are experiencing that threatens to undermine national competitiveness, actually, in this country. Incidentally, so I'm referring to the US in this particular context, but similar phenomena, maybe to a lesser degree, are evident in Europe and even in Japan. So I think we really should need a vaccine against that kind of thing. So I recently listened to, so you know how I spend my free time. I just listened to a podcast with Jon Stewart's daily or weekly show, and he had as a guest Jeffrey Hinton, who is often referred to as the godfather of AI because of his decades-long work in foundational work in this area. And he just said something which I thought was so well said that I will quote it in its entirety. He said, suppose you want to do one thing that would really kneecap a country, that would really mean that in 20 years' time, that country is going to be behind instead of ahead. The one thing you should do is mess with the funding of basic science, attack the research universities, remove grants for basic science. In the long run, that's complete disaster. So this was end of quote, and we can, I think he's really right here. And like Charles has said, that once we dismantle the scientific infrastructure and expertise, they are very difficult to rebuild, as even the people, the researchers migrate elsewhere or just abandon the field and find something else to do, or perhaps in other countries, as it's already happening. But equally critical and obviously closely linked is the restoring the public confidence in science. As I said earlier, so science today is often portrayed as the domain of coastal elites, whatever we are, and global technocrats, a perception that fuels this kind of a populist backlash. To rebuild trust, I think that the scientific community must embrace greater transparency and humility. So dismissive responses and lack of openness, like we saw in the reluctance to discuss the COVID-19 origins, these, I believe, have damaged credibility. So openness to legitimate debates and clearer communication of uncertainty are essential to reestablish legitimacy. So the fact, that you say, trust me, this is good, and we need this, that's not going to cut it in the future anymore. Also, science itself is becoming increasingly politicized. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which was originally created to synthesize and communicate peer-reviewed evidence, it has increasingly taken an advocacy role, and I'm not sure that's very good. It's understandable, but this shift risks further polarizing public discourse. If people see IPCC as taking sides, they will conclude that it is not purely impartial. For example, their persistent use of the extreme RCP 8.5 set emission scenario, despite that there's a clear understanding that it's highly unlikely to unfold, this may undermine confidence in climate projections. So the scientific community should resist both, obviously, denialism and so on, but also alarmism, focusing instead on a transparent, balanced communication of risks and evidence. And don't, Charles again was referring to that there's a tendency or temptation to suppress findings that are not in line with the political consensus, and that's on both sides of the aisle. So we should resist that temptation. So just very briefly, from my long experience with the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, I've seen the importance and challenges of integrating scientific evidence into decision-making there. The GEF was founded as a science-based funding mechanism, supported by two key advisory bodies. One was the Independent Evaluation Office that I headed for a decade until last year, and the other one was the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, or STAP, which has a role to ensure that the latest science informs project design and programming. And it does this, on the one hand, by reviewing project proposals, which immediately guarantees an instant feedback into programming. But its second role, which is also very important, is identifying emerging trends and scientific discoveries that have a bearing on the global environment. This is more challenging because the STAP conducts workshops, it conducts, does reports, it does research of its own, synthetic reports and forward-looking and all of that. And it presents these to the partners, to the governing council and so on. The question is, how does that translate, this kind of a horizon scanning, how does it translate into robust advice and concrete programming? And that's more challenging. Now, I think Angela's proposals for co-produced transdisciplinary research, these are very useful. And I think they can take us quite a way towards the right direction. Relevance and rigor, those were the two of the R's that you were referring to. So engaging scientists, communities, and civil society in jointly defining research priorities can strengthen trust. It will enhance policy relevance. It will bridge the gap between knowledge and action. But still, we must remember that not all research should be immediately instrumental. As Jeffrey Hinton reminded us, sustained investment in basic science remains the bedrock of future innovation and societal resilience. So ultimately, evidence-based policymaking depends not only on the sound data and technology, but on the institutions, norms, and trust that allow science to serve the public good. And rebuilding this foundation requires renewed investment in research, stronger science policy interfaces, and a culture of openness and engagement. And if and when we succeed with this, science can once again become a trusted foundation, a language, if you wish, for solving problems, and no longer being part of or being another arena for ideological conflict. Thank you. I took a little bit more time than I had planned, but I hope there's some useful.
Thank you, Juha. Those were very thoughtful comments, and I think between these three presentations, we have a lot of food for thought here. I can imagine there are plenty of questions in the audience. I have a few myself. I think first I'd like to ask our speakers if they would like to respond, or have any kind of additional thoughts or responses triggered by hearing the other speakers. And Charles, could I turn to you first? And just...
I'd like to ask Angela a couple of questions. One is, as you pull together different stakeholders to design questions which met the needs of the people who presumably would use the results, did it matter, for example, whether the scientists had an understanding of the economics and politics or whatever of fisheries, or had any understanding of economics and politics at all on any subject? Or is it okay just to, okay, here's my research, I throw it into the meeting? The second question, did you have any, most of the research that you're describing, I think, is mostly social science research. No, well, did you end up with any social science-based innovations? I mean, some very important social science-based innovations, focus groups, or ranked choice votings can make, they're as profitable as technological innovations. Anything like that come out of your system?
So on the first, great questions. On the first one, it really depended on what the team, how the research team was put together and the stakeholder team. So we would often have basic researchers involved in those teams, fishery scientists who study fish population and genetics to try to understand what the fish population, I mean, you just use the fish example, but they would need to be partnered with someone who understood, who sometimes we call them boundary spanners, someone who understood the other aspects of the problem and could bring the various lines of evidence and research and science together. Does it help when researchers of various kinds, whether they're natural physical scientists or social scientists, understand that there's a broader context out there? Yes, they're more likely it's more likely to be an efficient process. But the way our funding worked for those kinds of projects is that we also funded those boundary spanner facilitator. Sounds like they're just softly making sure everybody has a chance to talk. It was much more than that. It was really an integration, but that's a really key part of that. So we would often assure our basic research grantees, this is not about making you into going outside of your comfort zone. This is bringing you to the table to make sure we understand how your knowledge can feed into this process, but we make sure that there's someone there who can facilitate that. On the second one, I'm trying to think about that that question. I mean, I think that participatory technology assessment is an interesting intervention. We did not make that happen. That was our CSPO colleagues, but those are some of those interventions, innovations that I think are really promising, and we try to keep track of that. Like what are those systems and strategies and tactics that are really promising? So that's how I'll leave that.
May I ask you a question? I'd like to, as an old science advisor myself, I'd like to hear more about how those two science advisory committees worked, and how they got the 9 scientists that were the recipients of their advice. How do they sell these ideas? How did that work? Was there
in the GEF?
The GEF, yes.
Yeah, it's a long story, but so the panel is supposedly independent, although it is not entirely independent because it is organized under UNEP. And they put together the panel based on the topics of the what are the basic areas that GF works on. So it's biodiversity and climate mitigation and climate adaptation and chemicals and waste and so on. So you have a collection of scientists who have this technical knowledge. And there is a fairly strong secretariat here in Washington, D.C., which has also scientific expertise. So they can lead the process and in a way can be sort of like harnessing these scientists together, and the secretariat knows maybe perhaps better what the immediate needs of the GEF are. But there is this kind of a tension between the nitty-gritty of reviewing project proposals. The project proposals come from the recipient countries through the agencies that propose projects for funding, and of course, I mean, these projects seldom are particularly innovative, if you wish. Or there are innovations, obviously. I shouldn't say that. There are both social science and natural science innovations in these projects, but they are then looking at them, from the point of view what is there already. Then the other one is this horizon scanning area where they have looked into things like novel entities, everything from that come into the environment to AI to so on, and that's then that is this research is communicated to the GEF Council through presentations and reports, and of course the partners also get them. But there is a much more tenuous link to what gets actually done. Because you talk about novel entities to UNDP, who is basically helping a bunch of countries in Africa or where else to deal with global environmental issues. So that's a harder way of translating it into practice.
Thank you. Angela, do you have questions you'd like to pose to the panelists, other panelists?
I don't have questions. I might just draw out a few points, which is, and maybe not surprisingly, because I sit at the Pew Charitable Trust, but we sit alongside our cousins, the Pew Research Center. So I keep track of what's happening with how the public is thinking about various aspects of trust in particular. And I think there's still a strong signal that trust in scientists as individuals is still pretty strong. It's the institutions that we've got the trust eroding. And so I try to think about how that plays out and how we think about supporting different kinds of interventions and how to lean into that too. Now that may change. I haven't seen the latest. I think there's some new Pew Research Center data out as of last week on trust in higher ed institutions and how that's working. So anyway, I think going back to my evidence-based about how we think about all this, it's like where's the trust eroding and what does that mean for what we do about that? So that's one comment I'll raise. And the second is that in working with an observation over the last few months in this year of deep change, as we've been working with state legislatures on this new state science policy fellowship. And that what we see is still quite a bit of demand for research and science and evidence, and particularly around AI, that hasn't diminished. Their need for that and their demand for understanding option sets and what are the implications of different decisions on their desks. And so I think leaning into where there are still needs and demands and clear signals that are not politicized, right? These are across the board. What does that also mean for what we can do in this moment where there, at the federal level and national level, there's just, a lot of a lot afoot. So my two observations.
Thank you.
Can I just
Please.
make one observation? And I was thinking of the fisheries, especially here now. And so we get into perhaps into the domain of evaluation. But we can't either always assume that all stakeholder groups have the same interests. And I'm thinking of an evaluation that I've read about. I wasn't involved in any ways. Happened somewhere in I think in the New England area where it was a question about protecting a river, and there's both commercial fishermen, leisure fishermen, conservationists, energy and navigation people who are involved, and that was a fairly participatory and inclusive process. But the point that I'm trying to make is that although everybody had a stake in that river and wanted to protect it, the stakes and their goals were not identical. So those are the kinds of things that you have to also navigate.
Yes, agree.
Thank you. Well, I certainly have questions triggered by this very interesting discussion, but I think I'd like to turn first to the audience.
Hey, Tom, I'm from here at ELI. And NEPA is sort of at the heart of this big question of energy transition and permitting, et cetera, which is something that is on many people's minds, especially at the state level. And so there's so many threads to tie together. I hope this is gonna make sense in the end, but I mean, here at ELI, our work is to address urgent environmental problems, like helping communities or local governments or states to understand their legal and policy options and how to use law and policy to manage non-point source pollution or indoor air quality or data systems or whatever it may be. And it's also about helping decision makers understand the critical information that they need to understand, like climate science for judges or local fisheries officials, understanding the scientific aspects of fisheries. But our work is also about building this evidence base, doing the research to show that whatever policies we end up working to advance are shown to have the impacts. So a couple of questions occurred to me. One was about how do we, sort of ELI in our thinking, but this is a much broader question. It's not far from being just us. How do we maintain the integrity of the enterprise of science while also ensuring that policy or other governance decisions are appropriately based on scientific evidence? We've been thinking a lot since it's been part of our approach since our founding, but we've been focusing, especially in these times, on how to make sure that decisions are informed by science. But how do we maintain the integrity of the enterprise? I mean, getting to what this was you talking about politicizing the IPCC. Sort of how do we both have a science policy interface and protect the integrity of the scientific enterprise? And just like a different aspect of this that resonated with your comment and some things the panel mentioned is, and how do we, within that, we have to make trade-offs in this current time. We have to decide is building infrastructure for energy, renewable energy, do we need to, damage some wetlands or whatever it may be? So how do we use this to kind of figure out those trade-offs?
Great questions. Sandy, thank you. Anyone like to tackle those?
Well, I just have a follow-up question on that last part. So is there understanding trade-offs between different decisions is always true, right? There's always that reality of, if you do this, this is going to happen. If you do that, that's going to happen. So do you think there's a difference now? Yeah, okay. So that's what I would love to hear. That's a really interesting.
Carl Brook, ELI, I think that we are no longer talking about trade-offs. It's, denying the science so that
Mhm.
this is not an issue, so there are trade-offs.
Oh, interesting.
So, it's like, how do you weigh, or sometimes it's, it becomes very much values laden, and it's hard to step back, it's not an effective discussion around a lot of these things and the trade-offs with them.
Just a few simple.
These are very, very, yes, but maybe I mean what Carl is saying, so in some situations, the whole trade-offs question becomes moot, but it relates to this whole participatory decision making and planning and all of that, of course, that, we have different power relations and different groups have different powers, but and finally make decisions. But really, I think we in the GEF, for example, we did a fairly large evaluation looking at the synergies and trade-offs between different both environmental domains, looking what are the, sometimes you have conflicts between biodiversity conservation and climate, for example. So you plant trees which can act as carbon sinks, but can be detrimental to biodiversity. But then more often it was, of course, between the uses, the socioeconomic side of things and the environmental side of things. So it's important to have these processes where you are very clear, whether you're a scientist or an evaluator, where you are very clear on both the positive and the negative, both the the synergies and trade-offs that can be. I tend to be an advocate for really scientists and evaluators. I mean, you have stake in issues, and obviously know what is wrong, but what makes sense and what is right. But to maintain the credibility, you have to be able to see both sides of things in many ways.
Really, you would like to have scientists to present the data, and then a committee of some kind that says, yes, this is the right data, and policy organization that makes the ultimate decision based on the science and all the other stuff that feeds into a decision. This gets blurred in the middle, and these are all human institutions. Somebody appoints the committee. Somebody decides which scientist to ask for advice. Somebody abolishes the research institution that provides the data. So there's really no way to keep these things separate in the real world. Basically, you do the best you can, or you do the best that they let you, because this can work with the proper support at all levels. You can have all of these institutions that are separate. Even so, there are people involved.
Yeah, I think there are a couple more questions.
Hi, John Doherty with ELI. Thanks for the remarks. I had two questions, one for Juha and one for Angela. My question for Juha came out of something you said about the IPCC as sort of being seen as advocacy, and the example you gave was in certain contexts using the RCP 8.5 emission scenario, right? The high-end business as usual emission scenario. But the IPCC also looks at equally sort of low likelihood, low emission scenarios, right? They look at a range of all different kinds of scenarios. So do you think it's fair to characterize that kind of work as advocacy? Because I think there's legitimate scientific reasons to use and understand the upper bounds of the climate system and what the response of the climate system might be to those unrealistically high emissions scenarios. And my question for Angela was, I was really excited to learn more about the state initiative, the Science, Technology, and Policy Fellowships that you're setting up. And I wondered if there's scope to think about expanding those fellowships into the other two branches of government at the state level, both like the governor's office and also to state judiciaries that would benefit from scientists being placed there. So thank you.
Okay, so I think that IPCC has moved more into advocacy than it used to be, and it's not only the use of the RCP 8.5. And maybe it's not the IPCC's fault but it's just the fact that when you present that kind of a scenario, that's the one that all journalists and media pick up on. They forget about totally the other scenarios, the lower scenarios. And I think it contributes to the desperation that we see around people and so on. Incidentally, the desperation is gone down. It's curious. I can't help but to, because yesterday I read a piece on the fact that 5 years ago, something like 40% of Swedish kids thought we were all going to die because of climate change, and that has dropped to 13% this year. So there's been a major drop in that part of the existential crisis, and we don't know why it is, and perhaps it is because of the war and other crises have come up. But then, so sorry, that was a digression, obviously. But you know, with the RCP 8.5, when basically everybody, including IPCC itself, agrees that this is a highly unlikely scenario, that this means that this would materialize only if nobody did anything, and if there was no energy transition, and if renewable energy wasn't getting cheaper and competitive. So last year was the first time, it's largely thanks to China and India, but it was the first time when renewable energy, excluding nuclear, was actually the single largest source of energy in the world. It doesn't mean that it's more than half. It means that it's bigger than coal, it's bigger than gas, it's bigger than oil, it's bigger than nuclear. So there are trends. So and whatever some politicians might think, these are irreversible trends because of economics and all of that stuff. So maybe it would be time to retire the scenario that then, you know, gets everybody's attention. That's my kind of a point. But you know, in itself, that is not an IPCC advocacy.
Thanks for clarity.
Yeah.
And then just quickly on the state science policy fellowships, it is going to be the legislatures for the foreseeable future for a variety of reasons, where it started, and there's some partnership, the pilots that were in place already, but certainly there are folks who think about this at the governor's office level, and I think the state of North Carolina has had I'm just trying to remember that it's OSP, I think it's Office of Strategy and Partnerships, I can't remember, but it was set up to provide a bridge between North Carolina's research universities and colleges and all the capacity they have for providing research into the governor's office. It was set up to provide that bridge. So there are some examples, isolated examples, but for this particular initiative that we've just stood up, it will focus on state legislatures. But certainly those questions come up, and I think, you know, as we move into a scaled up version, I'm sure that will come back. So, because it's true, it's not just the legislators who have these questions. So it's good to keep it in mind.
Thank you. Carl.
I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on how much science, how do we think about how much science we need for decision making? I mean, part of it's that I feel like over the last 55 years in the US, we have realized that there are all these different sectors, that these sectors are interlinked, that they link to economy, to public health, to equity. It's getting really hard to, I mean, we have better understanding of the system, but to understand how does this particular policy choice affect everything and is affected by everything? How do you put boundaries on this so that you can actually make a decision?
Hey, you guys brought these really complicated questions.
The short answer is you do the best you can. The beginning of the longer answer is that you identify areas of uncertainty and try to reduce them. In fact, I argue for that there should be an obligation that everybody pulls their oar and trying to reduce them. Then the problem comes when the things that when you don't know what you don't know, which the argument there is that you better keep searching for new knowledge. There's no limit to how much you can do with that. So you have to be reasonable. I don't know that there's any, but scientists usually have a decent notion of how far they are along understanding a given issue and where the big areas of uncertainty are. They aren't always right, but they probably can tell you that, okay, climate, the big problem is clouds. Now maybe somebody else will come in from left field and say that they're something else. I don't have a better answer than that.
I mean, it's clearly a big question and not an answerable one, right? But I think, and of course it depends. The processes and tactics that I see, well, one thing I'll say is like, we don't, it definitely depends. And clearly, because these problems are complex, like science is not going to answer, it doesn't answer the values question. It just doesn't. It's going to tell you what happens if you make one decision or another. So what I've been looking to is the strategies that build these systems for acknowledging that and being able to evolve and adapt over time. So I'm thinking about Water Trust Australia, which was a collaboration of a bunch of Australian philanthropists. I don't know if you know this one, and they set up a 10-year project to get all the different stakeholders who are dealing with water issues in Australia and the scientists who are providing information about what that looks like. They funded a 10-year project cycle, so that over those 10 years, that relational bit is part of it. All the stakeholders are facilitated to get together. The scientists continue to feed information into that process, but it's over a 10-year period. So there's that long-term thinking, and there's the acknowledgement that like the science is going to change, and that's a reality, and the needs are going to change, and that's a reality, and even the stakeholders might change, and that's also a reality. But like over a 10-year period, how can we look at setting that up rather than funding more science at the time? Does that work? Does that intervention work? And how does it work? And of course, it's an isolated intervention. I think it's really interesting and promising, but I'd love to see more initiatives like that are acknowledging the realities of that complexity, acknowledging that there might not always need more science, but you might need science at different times or in different ways. And everything is going to be changing, especially with water issues or any. So that's what I look to, and when I'm thinking about what do I fund, do I think about funding more science, or do I think about funding more science and funding processes in which we try to account for all of that? I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure.
I think I mean, AI is perhaps an interesting case here because science and technology are advancing very fast, but there are a lot of these unknown unknowns, to quote one past thinker, in the process. And so there clearly is a need to regulate, and there's a clearly a need to have some sort of a policy which we don't have currently on AI and see where it is going. But there's also there's conflicting feelings. Some are very enthusiastic about it and think that this is gonna save humanity, whereas others think that it's gonna destroy humanity. So you need policymakers who have a certain level of understanding of science here, but and then who can then regulate the science also.
Mhm.
So, somebody.
Thank you. It's funny, he mentioned the 70s and it kind of took me back a little bit. And what I see as the years progress, what I see that is very, very positive is the cooperation and integration of the various fields of sciences. In the past, everybody is specializing in something and they're in their silos. And I see these days that, the civil engineers will cooperate with the environmental impact on water bodies and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that is a very, very good direction that the different sciences have taken. And what I see, and early on I realized that, and I'm a civil engineer by training. And the first thing I started looking at is how do the lawyers and the law address these, engineering questions. And that's how I first found out about the LI and really followed different activities at the LI. In any case, that is a very interesting thing. And what I see, a very, very important question right now in our time is how do scientists communicate the science to the public that it resonates to the public and the public will have the correct response. And many months ago, and I'm looking at the scientific papers that say, oh, sir, if the temperature goes 1 degree beyond such and such, we're doomed, or 2 degrees beyond such and such. That happens every day out there. So what is the response of the public? So we have to set up the criterion by which we convey the science so that it means something to the policymakers or the public or the policymakers. So that worries me. It's been worrying me for a few years now. And we have somehow to convey that in all the fields of science. And that is how I think we can make a difference, a dent in the current situation. That's
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our time, and that's actually, I think, a really powerful point to end on. And I think that's a theme that's come across in this whole conversation, is how to build trust between scientists and the public and decision makers. How part of that is going to be communication, stronger communication. And I take your point that the interdisciplinary communication within the scientific community maybe is a really valuable step in that direction. Addison, I don't know if we need to, do we have any time for final comments?
Sure,
from
we can do
the
final
panel?
comments.
And I guess I'd love to hear if
Angela,
there are
thank
any any closing remarks, or just, well,
Just that we need not only science, but also technology and innovation, including manufacture, commercialization, and making the thing happen. And second of all, we should be thinking long-term. And it's not clear whether long-term means 5 years, 10 years, or 30 years.
thank you.
Thank you all so much.